So if you're not an experienced sea kayaker, or if you don't have a kayak that has a rudder or a skeg, then you've probably seen a kayak that has one and said to yourself, what is that thing? Or why doesn't my kayak have one of those? Or maybe even, do I need one of those? Those are all good questions, and that's exactly what this video is about. So a rudder is a long fin-like blade that sits on the back deck of the kayak. And then when it's deployed by hull lines along the sides of the kayak, it drops down into the water. Now it's controlled by your foot pedals, which allow it to turn and help control the kayak. Now a skeg, on the other hand, is a fin-like blade that drops directly down from the hull of the kayak. Now it is, for the most part, for hard shell kayaks, it's retractable, meaning it can go back into a housing inside the kayak itself. On some inflatable kayaks, the skeg is permanent. It's just fixed to the boat, or it's removable. You either have it on or you have it off. But with a hard shell kayak, the skeg can be deployed at various depths. The biggest difference between a skeg and a rudder is the fact that a skeg doesn't turn, it just drops down. So what are rudders and skegs for? Well, both rudders and skegs are there to help you control your kayak. Now, a rudder is, because it moves side to side, it helps you steer your kayak. Now, does that mean you need a rudder? Absolutely not. You do not need a rudder. With good paddling technique, you can steer and turn a kayak as effectively as you can with a rudder. So if that's the case, what do you need them for? Well, to understand the answer to that question, we first have to talk about how a kayak travels through the water. And bear with me, I know that sounds dull, but it's actually kind of neat and it won't take long. Look at that guy right there. A little side story, I actually carved this kayak 30 years ago when I first got hooked on kayaking. I couldn't do anything but think, eat, breathe kayaking. Kind of still is the same way. Anyway, so how does a kayak act when it's traveling through the water? Well, when the kayak's going through the water that you're hitting on the front of the kayak is actually kind of holding the bow in place. It's putting pressure on the bow and stopping the bow from moving back and forth. Now, you have pressure all the way to the widest point of the kayak. And from that point back, there's no longer that water pressure of water hitting the kayak. So there's less pressure the whole way to the stern. And so the stern of the kayak is much more free to move back and forth. And that's why turning usually happens at the back. And that's why the rudder or skeg is at the back of the boat. Now, the purpose of rudders and skegs is largely because if you have a wind, in particular, a side wind, when that wind's hitting your kayak isn't going to move uniformly across the water because your bow, assuming you're traveling forward, your bow is being held in place by the water, but your stern is going to be moved by the wind faster than your bow. So what that means is your kayak will naturally turn into the wind. And that's something that's called weathercocking. What a rudder and a skeg does is it drops into the water at the stern, so when the wind is hitting it from the side, that stern can't be blown as easily. And so even though a rudder does help you steer a kayak, what it really does is it helps control the stern of your kayak when you have a side wind. Now, more specifically, how you're going to use a rudder is if the wind's coming in from my left side, my kayak is going to want to turn to the left. Well, I'm going to push on the right foot pedal to try to turn the kayak right. And that's going to counter the weathercocking effect. With a skeg, what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop that skeg down to help stabilize the stern and prevent it from being blown more than the bow. But something to note is that skegs can be dropped at any depth. The deeper you drop the skeg, the more it's going to pin or hold that stern in place. And so if the wind isn't that strong and your boat isn't weathercocking too much, what you can actually have is the opposite effect, is your stern is being held more than your bow and it'll turn away. And that's why a skeg can be deployed at different depths. It's not just on or off. It's a on to the degree you need it. What degree do you need it? Well, it depends on your boat. It depends on the strength of the wind, the direction of the wind, and it depends on a lot of things. It depends on your skeg. So time on the water is really going to answer that question for you, and that's a good excuse to go paddle more. So do you need a rudder or a skeg? Well, I think I already answered that question, and it's simply no. You definitely don't need a rudder or a skeg. Without a rudder or a skeg, you can control the weathercocking of your kayak, and you definitely can steer a kayak. You don't need a rudder to be able to steer a kayak. Now, how do you control your kayak or prevent the weathercocking of your kayak without a rudder or a skeg? Well, one technique is simply by using more sweep strokes on one side of your kayak or corrective strokes on one side of your kayak, which can be tiring if you're doing it a long way. If you're traveling a long way with a crosswind or a side wind hitting you the whole time and you're having to just sweep on one side, it's going to be exhausting. So the other thing you can actually do is tilt your kayak slightly into the wind. And by tilting your kayak into the wind, it will naturally want to turn in the other direction. Of course, to do that, you have to have the confidence and the comfort to hold your kayak on edge while you're paddling. And that's not for everybody. There definitely is a time and a place for rudders or skeg. And I would say, as a general rule, you should consider a rudder or skeg if you're going to be doing a lot of paddling in windy conditions, when you know wind is likely and you plan on covering some serious ground. You're not just going for a little paddle around the lake. You probably don't need a rudder or skeg in that scenario. But if you're covering some distance, and that's what you like to do, if you're touring in windy areas, then a rudder or skeg is a great idea. Now, typically, kayaks under 14 feet or so don't really need a rudder or skeg. It's not a bad thing to have one, but they don't really need one because they're very maneuverable on their own. Once you get above 14 feet, so long wreck touring kayaks or sea kayaks, that's when rudders and skegs become more valuable, because those boats, they don't turn well. And if you have a boat like that, it's probably because you're wanting to cover some real ground. You're going to paddle some distance, and therefore it could very well make sense to have a rudder or skeg. If your kayak doesn't have a rudder or skeg, can you put one on? Well, the answer to that is kind of. Some kayaks come ready for a rudder to be added, and they have holes already drilled and attachment points, and they're good to go. They just don't have the rudder and cables set up. In that case, you can get an aftermarket rudder system and install it yourself. Now, if you're a real DIY kind of person and you like doing things yourself, you can theoretically install a rudder on almost any kayak, but I mean, you're gonna have to drill holes in your kayak close to the waterline. You're gonna have to make some committing moves. And so you better be a person that can get creative and fix problems as they come up. Personally, I would not recommend it. If you really decide you want a kayak with a rudder, the secondhand market for kayaks is enormous. Sell your kayak and get one with a rudder. So we've talked about why you should have a rudder or a skeg. Now let's talk about why you shouldn't have a rudder or a skeg. Rudders sitting on the back of the boat here, they are extremely prone to damage. Whether you're transporting the kayak, carrying the kayak, or just paddling, these are not super solid. If you bang into them hard, they're prone to breaking. And the cables too, they're prone to breaking as well. So you have to treat them well. Now on top of that, I don't know how many times when I've been loading kayaks on the roof of my vehicle, I've ended up banging my head on this blade, or it's dropped down and whacked me. Or when I'm walking around at a launch, I don't know how many times I've shinned myself on a rudder. These things can suck as well. So it's not a great thing to have on your boat just for the sake of having it. If you're gonna have a rudder, you should want to use the rudder. Otherwise, get a kayak without rudder. Now, a skeg. The main drawback of a skeg is really that the skeg box, or the housing that's inside the kayak, it takes up storage space. And so if you like doing multi-day kayaking trips and you want to maximize how much storage space you have inside the kayak, well, you have a bit less because of it. In most cases, it's not that big of a deal. You can work around it. Another drawback of the skeg is that if you're a bit scatterbrained like I am, you can sometimes forget that the skeg is down and end up causing yourself more hassles paddling than you save. So if you do use a skeg, remember that you put it down. So with that said, the question that I'll answer to finish this video is, do I use rudders and skegs? And the answer to that is absolutely. Do I care if a kayak doesn't have a rudder or skeg? Rarely. I'm usually very happy to paddle a kayak that doesn't have one. The times that I really like having one, a rudder in particular, is when I'm paddling a tandem sea kayak and I have my daughter in the front, and then it helps to steer a tandem, a big long tandem kayak with a rudder at the back. Otherwise, I'm pretty indifferent unless I'm on a long tour in windy conditions. Then I like to have either. That's all I got to say about rudders and skegs. I'm sure there's more, but I've done enough talking. Please give this video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed it, and subscribe to Paddle TV if you haven't already. Leave a comment down below telling me what other tips, tricks, or things you'd like me to talk about, and we will see you again soon here on Paddle TV.